Welcome back, everybody, to the second turn for the Germans, day one, I guess technically October 17th, for Red Factories. As we've seen in the prior videos, the Russians are already starting at a bit of a deficit in terms of losses, but the Germans haven't exactly made a lot of headway on the map so far. Just showing off there that one of the leaders was already claimed by somebody. Claimed like way long ago when I actually started recording this, obviously, so weeks before the thread was ever created. As with the start of every turn, I'm going through every stack just to see which units are broken, just so I can open up the stacks and do it that way. There's actually a very handy button with Vassal that will speed that up once I actually remember that it exists. If you look at the top bar, or right under at least the file bar, menu bar, you'll notice on the second row, you'll have the German guy with the grenade. You got your line of sight, your distance, magnifying glasses, and so on. To the right of the green square, you'll notice there's a blue gun, and next to that there's a green sniper. You click on the blue gun, it'll actually circle every hex that has a broken unit on it. Very handy to find those units. Same thing applies with broken weapons. I don't think it works on vehicle guns, just because they don't have a specific counter for it. That's why there's the BMG malfunction. Those are actual counters, not you don't flip over the tank. Anyways, as we've also seen before, each side should get 2 self rallies that they have to make before any other rallies. If you're curious as to why exactly that is, it's because one, you need to self rally units first, or units without leaders first, because it's understood that you would get through those first. If there's any special actions that get eliminated, it kind of changes how a lot of the leader interactions work, in the sense that you could rally a leader that's broken nearby, and then just say, well, I don't need to rally those guys then, because I can just bring a leader during your turn. And the second instance as to why you self-rally units is because leaders technically are always supposed to go first for rally purposes. So you do your self-rallies, and then you do in stacks, obviously, as not as groups, but at least in stacks, and you're supposed to rally leaders first. And you have to, whenever you use a leader, you have to use whatever bonus they're attributed. So if you have a 6+1 leader, which is obviously the worst kind of leader, they're kind of the bumbling idiots of ASL. They're handy in the sense that you can prevent units from cowering, and you can do a couple other things, like there's always kindling, which I don't think we'll see in this campaign. I forget if it's allowed, but even if we do, it probably won't happen soon. Not in the initial series of pre-recorded episodes anyways. But the big thing is that your 6+1 leaders, you have to apply their bonuses. So you can't just say, well, I'll self-rally this leader even though he's in a stack with a terrible leader, and not take that bonus. That just it doesn't make sense. And it also it skirts around those bad leaders. If you have bad leaders, you have to kind of be mindful about where you actually position them and how useful they will or won't be. Anyways, so any unit that is stacked with a leader that is good order, so that isn't broken itself, is allowed to attempt to rally. Generally speaking, when it comes to rally attempts, you either get a heat of battle from Snake Eyes or 2-1s. You either successfully rally your unit. You also either don't rally your unit, obviously, or you can have them suffer a casualty reduction. That's usually the only range. I don't think there's any other range of things that can happen during a rally attempt. Obviously, casualty reduction on boxcars and your heat of battle on a Snake Eyes or critical, rarely do they happen. And the big thing to always take away is that when it comes to rallies, you want them in, I forget, is it called entrenchment terrain? I'm sure I'll look it up for the next video or whatever. But effectively, you want them, the best conditions you can have is for them to rally in a building or a woods hex, one of the two. The reason for that is that the building or hex inherently gives a -1 to your dice roll modifications. So it immediately makes any roll that much easier. And that is counted separately from your leader bonus as well. So even a regular 7-0 leader can, if you're in a building, will have an overall -1. Obviously, we're not taking into account desperation morale, which is the +4. That's always annoying to see. Here I got the artillery going, and I'm just checking as a continuation because the continuation is kind of automatic. If you can still have line of sight on your target, then the artillery piece is way off board, don't need to re-aim as to where they're shooting and so on. Unfortunately, we can see that all my dice rolls are garbage. You can pull up a handy statistics tool if you want. 8.43, it's higher than your average. The average is supposed to be 7-ish. Obviously not super great, but that's ASL right there. You should always try to get aim for your 7 as a result. So basically what it means is that if you're planning on shooting at an enemy and you're not quite sure if you're going to get a good result or whatnot, you're always worried about it. Try to aim for that 7, because if you can get like a normal morale check on a 7, something around those lines, after modifiers, obviously, then you're generally good to go. And obviously that shouldn't stop you from taking chances. So I think here I'm just checking to see what exactly I want to shoot with. The further I get into videos, I'll generally be a little bit faster, I think, with what I'm going to shoot and where. And the big reason is because you kind of want to plan things out properly with regards to your shots. Obviously, it's kind of like a basic piece of advice, and I think I've said it maybe twice before already. But when you have so many units, the biggest decision you have to make is which ones are you going to move and which ones won't you. In this case, it was probably really good that I decided not to move my tank and take that shot. For those curious, the reason why I'm not moving the tank, even though that under normal circumstances, probably a really good idea, especially since I'm right next to that gun. One, I already have an acquisition counter on that gun, so all my subsequent shots are going to be better. Secondly, if I decide to move, I run the risk of being shot by that AT gun. Just obviously staying there obviously is going to give me that same problem, quote unquote. But at least by not moving. How do I put this? Like, there's nowhere for me to go. If I get closer to the Russians, they can enact what's called street fighting. Even if there's no street fighting technically in play, just getting in close quarters with all those Russians and not much support nearby is not a very good proposition, if you ask me. Another thing I should mention is that the crew there managed to pass their morale check, and that was even after the 7. So you could see that, like, it's always tough to get rid of units with 8 morale. Another thing to point out is that if you use the modification for your terrain effect modifier, so on this table we can see target based hit determination DRM and letter Q. If you use your TEM for the 2 hit roll, you can't apply it to the IFT roll that comes afterwards. The game basically says it's a trade-off between whether or not the hit is whether or not the unit hits, or how severely it hits. Kind of think of it that way. Another thing I'm doing wrong here, and I only learned this probably like 3 or 4 days ago while reading up on the rules. Look, sometimes you're bored during your lunch hour or whatever at work. I learned that if I shoot my machine guns on a tank, specifically the coaxial machine gun on my tank, at a target that is not my acquired target, it drops the acquisition on said target. So technically, in all of the shots I will do with that tank especially, but most certainly with the other tank as well, all those tanks, all those machine gun shots that I will take at one point or another should cause the acquisition to drop. If they're not already the acquired target. So, apologies for that. Obviously, I think it's a good time to point out that it would have probably been nice to have those rolls on my artillery. But I won't pass them up on easy kills or casualty reductions for the Russians there. I think I forgot to declare something here. I'm looking at this excitedly and I'm going back and forth. But technically that giant stack with the DC shouldn't be able to hit F6 because of the debris acts as a half hex. So instead, how I counted it was just the 4 firepower from the one guy. That's how I should have done it. If I didn't, then apologies to the viewers. The Russians also get some pretty bad rolls here. Yeah, looking at the tanks, it's kind of the issue constantly when I'm looking at this map, because I really want to use tanks for this, and you're giving them right off the bat, so you kind of want to make the best use of them, but just getting close to Russian units is really, really tough. That being said, you kind of need to know a little bit when to be aggressive with your tanks. In a different scenario, entirely in against one of the guys I play against. He's currently got some. He had some guys stuck in some woods, and he couldn't do anything with them because they were broken. And because the tanks that I'm using in that scenario are really bad, there's not much I have in terms of available targets, and I was close enough that you want to close the distance in that scenario, because a unit that can't route away just it gets eliminated. So, and you can't. One thing that I learned recently too was that if a unit is routing, let's say, so every unit, assume that they generate a zone of control to every hex adjacent to them. So if a unit happens to be, let's say, in hex, what is that, U2? Yeah. So hex U2, if there was a guy there, and for whatever reason we said that he could route to T1, S1, R1, and all the way back to the main German group of guys, he wouldn't actually be able to route through T1. And the reason is because there's another unit, like they would still be in the same zone of control, and therefore they're eliminated for that reason. Similarly, they wouldn't be able to route to T2 or V1 or V2 and so on. There's like one exception to that, and that's if you're in close combat or melee, technically. That can change. You could have I believe it allows you to actually route through in that instance. But again, very, very sort of rare stuff. So I'm not sure if I mentioned it in audio form, but the Germans are actually forced to pick artillery hexes before the Russian setup. So if you ever think it's like weird how I place my artillery, that's kind of the limitation that you have. You really, and especially as a solo game, you really don't want to like mess around with those sorts of rules, because it's already gamey enough when you're playing against yourself and you kind of know where certain units are and what like quote unquote secrets exist. For example, one of the things you can buy in future dates. So after a day completes, you get points, and then those points are used to purchase more things, so that you can populate the map some more, or repopulate it as it might be. So, in say the next day, if I was to ever purchase mines, which is a thing you can actually get, if I was to purchase mines, I wouldn't be able to really do anything with them, because mines are inherently a device that works purely on surprise. So if I know that a minefield is at whatever location, unless I also know it's a dummy, then like why ever risk going into that hex? So it puts a damper on certain things. Technically, there's a rule that says that you would know anyways, but that's besides the point. And only specific to like, this campaign and like maybe a couple other things. But in general, if I was to say purchase mines, my opponent wouldn't know where they are unless I chose not to hide them or something stupid, or B, the mines would, like, I wouldn't know what strength they are. So, and that is actually a major thing. You can get many different strengths or factors of mines, and the higher the factor, the more damage they do, and so on. It's really handy to have in defensive scenarios, but sadly, it won't be the case here. The only reason I'm really moving up is because I don't want to get shot by that anti-tank rifle. It probably won't do too much. Anti-tank rifles aren't super strong. Actually, let me see what specifically the value they have. Because anti-tank rifles do have a 1-12, but to be more specific, that 1-12 is their firepower, but not their kill number, which is two very different things. And one should always take into account that those are two very different things. And there's also something else I learned a while ago, at least, but I never really thought about it, and it makes a lot of sense. So a unit that routes away. So for instance, if I had a unit, well, picture any unit here. If a unit tries to route away, interdiction applies as a means of something's firepower and distance. So, for example, in hex C3, I believe that's C3 anyways, there's a 467 squad. Well, an anti-tank rifle actually projects out 12 hexes, and it has its own firepower of 1. So you can actually interdict with that anti-tank rifle, which you wouldn't really think about because it's just anti-tank rifles kind of just fulfill one purpose, and that's it. And that's really just for vehicle destruction. Anti-tank rifles have a basic to kill of 5. So in an instance where that anti-tank rifle would shoot at a Panzer III-H, the Panzer III-H, I believe, has 5. It has 6 or 5 armor. Armor factors in the turret, I believe. And yeah, that means that you'd have to get a 1 or less, which isn't technically possible. So yeah, Panzer III-H has 6. So, and I believe that's for the turret, and the hull is a 3. So basically, it's a long shot. Your anti-tank rifle is not going to do much unless you attack, say, from the sides or the rear or something along those lines. Another thing that comes to mind now, but I don't ever really use it, is a deliberate immobilization attempt. Although I think it's just called the DI. And the obviously, as it says, you're trying to a DIA. You're basically attempting to shoot the tracks specifically. So there's some limitations as to how to perform that. And it's obviously tougher for whoever's shooting, but it is handy to at least know that rule actually exists. Here, let me see if I can pull up the interdiction stuff. Yeah, so interdiction is written as the following in the rulebook. It says a routing unit which enters an open ground hex without low crawl in both the line of sight and normal range of an unbroken enemy unit capable of fire on it in that hex with at least 1 firepower without any form of line of sight hindrance is subject to a normal morale check and everything that normally entails. So basically, a unit that would normally have, say like our militia company 426, if you give them an anti-tank rifle, that you've now just sextupled their interdiction range, which is frankly amazing. You really want that sort of thing to occur. So as with all snipers, you always do random selection if there's more than one potential target. Obviously, there's certain things that won't apply when it comes to those those limitations. For example, if there was a dummy stack, it'd be eliminated, but a dummy stack isn't in here, so it doesn't apply, and so on and so forth. But that's why you always want to keep in mind what you're doing and how much you're shooting and so on. You don't run the risk, I would say, too highly of running into snipers, unless the opposing side has a high sniper activation number. I believe for the campaign, this campaign specifically, you can get it up to like 6 or 7, I think. I don't think you can get higher than that. So if you think your opponent's putting a lot of effort into just rolling for the sake of rolling, if you know your opponent likes to roll for that sort of thing, then it's in your best interest to raise those numbers, especially when both sides can. Well, the Germans can raise their sniper activation number 30 times, and the Russians can do the same. So, yeah, if you know your opponent's going to roll a lot, you have no excuse really to boost that number. You can't just spam it and get it up to 7 every time. There is a limitation on how many times you can buy it per day and so on. But it's definitely something useful to know. I probably won't come to the realization for a long time. Well, I shouldn't say that, but the placement I have for my mortar is up here in Hex B2. I don't, looking back on it, I don't think it was really good. Unfortunately, there's not much I can really do just with the closed nature of Stalingrad. It'll probably be much handier, more useful once we get to certain other portions of the map. Once the map opens up a little bit, basically, because at the moment the only thing I could really do would be to put them under enemy contact, which again, because of a blind hex rule, I didn't understand correctly. I could be doing a lot more with my mortars right now, but specifically in B2, it's kind of a really bad location because, as you can see, just where they are, there's a lot of buildings around them, which blocks line of sight. So I have to use an observer. But if I use an observer, I'm basically occupying that leader from being able to provide a benefit to anything else. And there's also a negative value to being an observer. So, not exactly the best of decisions to take. But again, it's really tough to get this sort of to get line of sights down, or more specifically to plan out mortar use. I'm not. I think I'm okay with it, but there's definitely things I could improve on. Another thing I didn't do, I think, at all, which is a really big mistake on my part, is that, one, I'm moving as a stack, and I really shouldn't. I don't know why the hell I'm moving as a stack. But secondly, the other issue, yeah, seriously, this is where I like playing against myself, because I can punish myself for like these stupid decisions. Don't move as a stack, guys. There's no if you have no reason to move as a stack, don't move as a stack. Because I'm putting that's a -4, because there's -2 for non-assault movement in open ground, but also a -2 from the leader, so it's down 4. So that's actually a 2 on 6, which is a 1 KIA. So don't move as a stack in open ground. It's dumb. At the worst, you should do a leader with a squad, and never more than that, or leader with a half squad. But you really shouldn't ever do that, because that's how you lose units. Anyways, getting back to it, one of the reasons why I don't feel like I use my my mortars properly, and this is actually and I lose Because it's a 1 KIA, they're eliminated, and so that means that because of random selection to determine the whoever becomes eliminated, since there's a tie, it means that both of them are eliminated. So I just threw away. I think that's how much is that? 3 CVP, 3 casualty victory points away. Really poor choice on my part. Getting back to the mortar thing, so one, you can area fire a target, like you can shoot at a target that's at the second floor, and that's I think something that I would easily say that as a new player, or when I was a new player, I should say, because I mean I have been playing for years. I don't know all the rules perfectly, but you get there eventually. But one of the things I never really think about is putting smoke on a location. And the reason I say that is because when you're using a mortar, it counts as area fire, and area fire and together with the area target type, the ATT basically attacks everything in a hex. So the reason why that's like really important is that I decided to assemble my mortars, and the fact that I'm not assembling them yet is kind of indicative of why I think that's I've been doing it poorly. I should have assembled them this turn. But getting back to the rules here, because the area target type attacks everything in the hex. The important part is that you can drop smoke and it'll smoke the entire hex, which is very useful. We've already seen smoke from a burning vehicle. The +3 is the hindrance that provides, and the level is how high that smoke goes. So the important part is that you're blocking something up to level 2, which means everything behind that it isn't a blind hex, but gets that bonus from that. Another thing that I hadn't realized for a while until I actually started playing quite a bit, anyways, was the covered arc counter for your machine gun. It's actually really important to put this because a machine gun, at least a medium machine gun and heavy machine gun, if it shoots out of a building or a woods hex, one of the two, and anything that's considered those, anyways, you have to notify which hex side they're shooting out from. The reason behind it is that in a medium or heavy machine gun emplacement, especially say for like a MG34 or a Maxim machine gun and so on, you can't move those around very easily. So it wouldn't make sense if a machine gun was say shooting up northwest, and then if it had rate of fire, it spun around and shot to the southeast. We're talking about a building. It would have to basically tear down, move the gun to the other side of the building, reset up, and then shoot again. And in the 2-minute time that the game allots for its in-game turn time, it just wouldn't make sense. So the more specific reason why you want to enforce that, if you'll want to enforce that regardless if you're attacking or defending as your objective for the game, but you really want to point that out, because now if I move anybody from, say, this area that my mouse is now over, that machine gun can't turn around and shoot them. If it does, I think there's like huge penalties or whatever to it, but the main benefit obviously is that it can't now take action against those guys, which is super important. That's a 8 on 8, So it should be a normal morale check. Again, excuse me. Again, that's because of the 4 firepower, doubled because they are an adjacent target. So, a normal morale check, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, the half squad actually passes because of the leader bonus. That's also why when you're rolling morale checks, you always declare a leader first. Every leader goes first because of the fact that they apply their modifier to other units. Another thing to take into account with regards to leader bonuses, or when leaders apply their bonus, they can't apply it to themselves. It's not possible. One, it wouldn't make sense, especially when you come to the later on. We should see like a 10 -3 leader. Those are the best you can get in the game. They're obviously super strong because even a -1 is very powerful in the right location. But doubly so for something that's -3, or triply so, I guess, whatever. Because these guys are shooting a second time in a hex that is next to them, their firepower is halved and doubled again for adjacency. So, or point blank fire as it's called in the game. So, halved for subsequent, doubled, so it's still a 4, and unfortunately that is not much of a result to begin with. Again, this is why you roll you move one at a time. This is the second time that I move a group as a squad when they really don't need to. The Russians roll because I immediately spot my own error, and I'm not doing this on purpose, guys. If anybody's wondering, I realize it's a bad mistake. I get a really good roll, and even though it's a +1, both of those units will either get pinned or break. They should actually both break. So instead of having 8 firepower that I've now transferred a little bit further to the west, and I can do something with those guys. Now they're stuck, and I have to hope that I can extract them, get them to a leader, and then waste that leader's time with rallying them to be fit again for combat operations. Oh, yeah, that's another thing too, that I wouldn't have made the move had I recalled this, and that's why I'm gonna play through it anyways. Especially since you don't get 3s too often. Although I guess in this video we've seen it like 4 times after I got the stats table. So I'm just gonna play through it anyways, and not back them up and not scratch that result. But under normal circumstances, a hex can only, or a location, not hex completely, but a location can only hold up to 3 squads and 3 single man counters, I believe. I think any more than that is you start to incur penalties. And the idea is that if you have an extra squad, it costs 1 movement factor for every squad extra in that hex. So if it costs 2 to get in, and you bring a 4th squad in, it's now 3 movement factors to get in. If you bring in somebody else after that, it's now 4, 5. If you bring a 5th one or a 6th one, and so on and so forth. There's some exceptions to that, but not in like a good way. The exceptions would be if there was like a bunker, or better example yet is there's like shell holes or foxholes. Foxholes can only hold a certain amount of guys. Anything else than that, and they just don't count as being in the foxhole. They would count as open ground. So some differences and similarities there. Trying to figure out what exactly I'm looking up here. This is the beauty of doing recordings like 2 weeks after I record the actual video footage for this. I think I was just thinking of my next move. Yeah. Demolition charges are actually really interesting. Sadly, I don't think I'll have like a successful use for them in the pre-recorded stuff. Suffice to say that there's a lot you can do with them. They obviously always involve stuff exploding, and they can be pretty fun, just because of their high firepower. Oh, another thing I like never do, and that's kind of dumb. Like you should really get in the if you plan on playing this, you should always get in the mindset. I don't know why I'm moving as a stack again. I keep saying like it's a really bad idea, and yet here I am like constantly doing it. I think it's because I knew like how far guys could shoot, and that's again a problem with knowing stuff. But one thing you want to do if you ever happen to play this is there's what's called residual firepower or residual fire. The basic understanding of it is that because of the way that this board game represents real life, not obviously in the strictest of sense, but because it tries to at least make sense in a real situation, and because turns take 2 minutes, and even though everything happens in like a subsequent way, like that's why obviously you can't move all your units at the same time. You do it one at a time, and so on and so forth. The main takeaway to keep in mind is that even though unit moves are sequential, it's understood in like the rules of the game that everything happens at the same time. So, geez, this is crazy stuff. Yeah, this was also, I forgot a sniper roll. I think for the Germans, was it? Germans or the Russians? I forget which one. And obviously I roll a 2 because, duh. Yeah, so I think I'm rolling the 4 firepower against the broken leader. He'll obviously get a desperation morale because he's come under fire. And I'm going to have to roll to see if he gets wounded or not. Or at least wound severity. So if he had rolled 6, then he would have been eliminated. And I think anything else and he gets wounded. So I think I changed that soon enough. So if a sniper happens to land in an area that has no unit in them, do not worry. You now have to trace a distance to the nearest unit or units, plural. Is kind of cheap, and I shouldn't have checked that because you're always enticed to go with the biggest stack. But if you don't know what's in the stack, you shouldn't do that. In a real life, you wouldn't be able to check the stack. So the main takeaway there and why it's important is that, or at least important to understand the rules behind that, is that for the sniper determination, the main thing you want to keep in mind is that it picks the nearest unit, but also if there's a tie, and this is also like I just rolled a 2 for the Russians, and I get another 2. This is really bad. This is a really bad turn for the Germans. Um, but it was on subsequent fire, so it can only do so much. Maybe it'll probably do more. Um, Again, that's just there's a doom stack here, so technically I should have rolled the leader first. I think I rolled for him. No, should have rolled the leader first, but anyways, so he gets wounded. I believe. I don't think he gets eliminated. I think he gets wounded. Or no, sorry, he has to roll a wound wound determination to see how bad it was. Anyways, lot of bad fire there, or a lot of good shots with the Russians, but bad locations for the Germans. And also why you should just play through errors, because or else I wouldn't have had this giant doom stack that's about to get destroyed. So the sniper, you've determined how many units are closest to the sniper. If there's a tie, you pick the one with the worst or the least benefit to it in terms of terrain effect modifiers. So if you have two units side by side, equidistant to the sniper, one is in a woods hex that gives you just a +1 versus a concrete building that gives you a +3, the sniper must choose the woods hex. In the event that both are equal, the player is allowed to choose which hex is becomes the culprit, so to speak. So obviously, it's in your best interest to then choose the bigger stack. But if it's a bunch of fakes, then you could be caught out by that. And yeah, it was just a normal morale check, which I'm surprised. I thought it would have been like a 1 morale check or something. But yeah, we can see had that been at any higher firepower, everybody in that stack would have probably been dead. And I was actually really lucky not to lose my leaders, because that brings a leader loss morale check, and it's just additive at a certain point with how bad that is. Here we can see that the anti-tank gun actually gets a hit. I'd forgotten that they actually got a hit. I was wondering, seeing in the future and forgetting how things played out exactly, just how that anti-tank gun came to be. Technically, I guess I could have run them away in the previous turn, but getting the Germans to where they're at just makes it really unlikely for that anti-tank gun to get away now. And this is why. Now I remember why that tank didn't die. Under normal circumstances, I believe that would have been a side hit. So it would have been 3, I think. Should be that 3. It's 3 or 4. Anyways, so it would have been 3. The 45mm had like a 2-kill number of 11 or whatever it was. So it, in all likelihood, that tank should have been dead. But thankfully, the Russians seem to have a supply of bad ammo that they're giving their anti-tank guns. Also, keep in mind, rate of fire for units is really important, and you should always try to keep in mind what the rate of fire is for your various guys. Don't be afraid to double check units just to see. The rate of fire is usually the encased number on a counter. In the instance of a light machine gun, it should be the only encased number. If there's none, it just means there's no rate of fire. On a tank, it's the number that's above the size of the gun. So in the Panzer IIIs that we have, it should be 50mm, and above that 50 numeral, there will usually be a number in a square. In the Panzer's case, I believe it's a 1. Actually, I think it's a 2. I think it's 2, yeah. Unfortunately, the Russians don't seem to be able to keep up the crazy amount of good rolls that they had. Um, kind of wish I'd been able to keep those rolls going in a way, just to make it tougher for the Germans, and also to pay them back for all the losses the Russians have been incurring so far. Generally speaking, I like to put um, good order units, so functional ones above non-functional ones. But it's more of a personal preference type thing, depending on who you are. Um, you can imagine that if you're playing this on a board game, like on the as the actual pieces, which I have, but I've seen some people do videos of them playing on the actual boards and with the actual counters and all that. Gets super hectic, super fast, and boy howdy, I wish I had a table and space on it to, play a campaign game for 3 years on it. So yeah, and it's the benefit of having this on a PC, and also a shame that there's never been, well, there's been one official squad leader product for PC, but let's just say that the micro pros that made it, the developers that made it, didn't exactly adhere to the same rules as Advanced Squad Leader does. It's a completely or almost a completely different game, and can't wait to show that off in like 2 years or whatever. Maybe as a bonus to this campaign, I'll do a let's play of that game too. It's enjoyable, but man, enjoyable in like me as a kid 20 years ago or whatever. It's hard to play that these days and not, tear your hair out a little bit. Now, because of the on the IFT roll, I rolled a 1, but one of the things to keep in mind as a player is that in the advanced fire phase, you don't get rate of fire. Period. Because of like the time involved to get to a new location and so on, and like for the I don't want to say sake of brevity or anything, but there's just you don't get a rate of fire in advanced fire phase. Okay, so I was talking about residual fire a while ago, and events kind of got the better of me. So, residual fire, let me pull up the rule here. Also, this is the great thing about having the an online rule book and stuff for a video series, so I can just pull it up whenever and look at the rules. Also, when this goes on Twitch or whatever, why I encourage people to ask about them. So the idea is that for residual fire, if you're in the movement phase and the defending player shoots at the attacking player, aka the non-moving player shoots the moving player, you have an opportunity after your roll is calculated to determine whether or not you have left any residual fire. So generally, how it goes is that you take the total firepower that you used to shoot at a location, you divide it by 2, and then on the infantry fire table, you go down a column for every terrain effect modifier that is applicable to that shot. So if you had, say, a +2, you'd go down 2 columns. If you had just had a +1, you go down 1 column, etc. The main reason why you want to use this a lot as a new player, it's probably one of the more important rules to figure out. Definitely more important than the understanding that if you roll the exact same number as a as your morale and a morale check, you pin. You don't pass it scot free. You actually get pinned. Don't worry about that rule if you're a new player, especially if you can learn residual firepower a lot earlier. I didn't really put any emphasis on learning residual firepower, and at the end of the day, it's way more useful than some other rules out there. Now, the reason why I say all this and why it's super important is that residual fire, even though it might just be a 1 firepower, it could be a 2, it could be 4, 6. I believe the highest you can ever get is 12. Although that's probably a lie, but I don't think I've ever seen more than 12 on an actual residual firepower hex or counter. Technically, I guess you could go up to 18 if there's no other modifiers. Yeah, because we can see 36 is the highest on this table. Not sure if there'd be anything else. Regardless, the main point to remember is that residual firepower remains on every last one of those hexes that it would apply for the entire movement phase. And the reason this gets really important is that because, again, turns are thought of as happening sequentially. Like this guy, I shouldn't even shoot because there's technically no way for him to get out. But anyways, so the reason why that's super important, especially for new players, is it blocks off those hexes from quote unquote being safe. And the basic idea is that, let's say I don't want to move my guys as a giant stupid hex that's a big target that will see me lose a leader and a full squad. If your opponent decides to move groups 1 by 1, every time they move through that hex with anything, it automatically suffers a firepower attack of that strength. And again, the reason this is super important, especially in open hexes, is that they still suffer the minuses from non-assault movement and open ground, that sort of thing. It's really an effective way to lock down areas, and also to prevent your opponent from, say, throwing out a half squad to draw fire, just for bigger and better units to come in behind it without suffering any sort of penalty. If you're able to, get a unit in, or if you're able to get shots in and do damage, or even if you fail to do damage, you can still leave residual firepower in a way that prevents anybody else from exploiting that sort of issue or that sort of thing. I think that was an illegal move for me to do. Although technically I had a leader go with them, because if you're over your portage points, I think a broken squad has to drop it unless there's a leader with them, but I forget. It'll be something I'll have to read up on again. It should be stated that there's certain things that won't leave residual firepower, and there's certain things that aren't affected by firepower. So the main thing to remember is that firepower really only affects machine gun, or residual firepower is only really affected by machine guns, and soldiers. You can't leave residual firepower as a gun. There's also a couple other things too, like let's say you had a Stuka dive bomber and a Stuka drops a bomb. It doesn't leave residual firepower. Artillery doesn't leave residual because it doesn't occur in the move phase. So, although I forget if... Now I'm not sure if it could during your own turn, because that happens before the movement phase. I guess I'll have to look up on that as well. But the point is that super important. Oh yeah, okay, never mind. So off-board artillery and minefields never leave residual attack because they attack any units that enter the minefield or FFE blast effect. Yeah. Anyways, point is that it only occurs. Residual fire only occurs during the movement phase, and as soon as the movement phase is over, you take those counters off the board. But again, it's really important to have. It's really important to use. So we can see, obviously, the Germans are having a little bit of luck after their advancing fire at breaking a couple locations for the Russians. But although they can get into some very good defensive positions with buildings because those concrete structures are +3, the line of sights are still really terrible. So I can't do much in terms of preventing certain things. Like I think this militia guy gets away. I forget. But the line of sights are bad, so it's still really hard to actually do damage to the rest of the Russian line. I guess I should mention that the reason why there's a lot of units on the right side of the Russian side is that I didn't really understand just how, again, the debris line of sight was affected by higher level groups. So I kind of missed out on being able to punish the Germans a lot, but also I didn't get to take advantage of the massed firepower that the Germans would have against anybody that shot at them. So it's kind of two-way street on that one. But the more important thing was that I kind of assumed that if the debris field acted the way I thought it would, then I would have a strong position to just sort of set up in the middle and then pick at which side I would prefer going after. And if I could get to the river, then at least I can extend the line and make it that much harder for the Germans to do anything. But that wouldn't be the case so far, anyways. Another thing that's really important to do when playing, you should always route as the attacker always routes first, and that really is to determine the effect of units being failing to route. It's also meant to punish the attacker in a way, because if the defending side doesn't is forced to route first, then there's how do I put it? The defending side first routing doesn't specifically affect the attacker's routes, but it does change where they're going to route and how far and such. So it's important to keep that in mind. Anyways, after the move phase, I generally clear all the moves that are the move thing that adds to the side of the counter, just so I know once I get into the advanced phase, which I can determine real easily which units I've moved in the advanced phase versus moved in the move phase. It's also handy to keep that on. Actually, yeah, you should only take it after the advanced fire phase, because then you'll know which units should suffer the penalty for moving like that. I think technically I can move that squad with the prisoners off map to collect a specific bonus right away, but there's no real point for me to do so. And regardless, I would have lost the ability to use that half squad. So I'm just gonna keep them. Excuse me. I'm gonna keep them where they are. I might move them. I think I move them later. But effectively, that half squad's kind of useless. It's also why in certain scenarios you have the ability to declare what's called massacre. And massacre is where you have the ability to capture units, but you decline for whatever reason, and because of that, you seriously affect how future surrenders and stuff will apply. You also get more points if you capture units rather than kill them, but that doesn't really come up too often. Here in this close combat phase, I'm basically declaring that each squad acts independently of each other to attack the crew. And the reason I do that is because I want to not have a +2 to my roll, and I'd rather have 2 separate chances at killing the crew than 1, even if their firepower, like I could be at a 4-to-1 rather than a 2-to-1. But I'd rather, when you have a +2 total modifier, I'd rather not, waste my chance. And I think in keeping with tradition, I should be rolling for Germans first as the attackers, and then the Russians. So 7, so that's a miss, I believe. I don't think that kills them. And then the Russians? Why did I... So apparently I rolled the first German squad, and then the Russians, and then the second German squad, and I'm not quite sure why I did that. Because normally, I don't think you do it sequentially. But anyways, so that crew unfortunately did not make it out. Had that not been a successful close combat, you would have entered melee. So it just means that the close combat continues until the next turn, and then you do stuff in that close combat phase. It is also possible for you to try and retreat, and I think it might get covered in a future episode, but unfortunately it'll have to wait until then. So as always, thanks for watching. I hope you stick around for more. It'll continue to get more and more exciting.